Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Your credit card numbers and other important data. Protocol analysis is subtle. There are two issues. There's currency, so an attacker can use multiple sessions and use data from one session to launch an attack on another session. You can use data from one protocol to mount an attack on another protocol, and so on. Also, underlying math is relatively hard. So what you start with is what cryptographers give you, and they give you something like RSA, and they tell you, well, assuming factoring is hard, any probabilistic polynomial time machine is going to have a hard time winning this game. And you have to take that and based on that prove something about a real protocol that sends bits around the network. So their relatively small size makes them a good domain for logical methods. And this has been an active research area for the last 10 or 15 years now. So when you hear about a protocol being broken, it's usually there's an implementation bug. So roughly speaking, we can classify protocol attacks into three groups. Most common ones, buffer overflows, format string vulnerabilities, just arise because the protocol is implemented in a bad way. So these are the most common things, and they're easiest thing to fix. More subtle attacks have to do with either cryptography breaks. One of the famous examples is 802.11b, where the encryption scheme itself was broken in a pretty bad way. They're completely destroying any private information that you send over a wireless network. And even assuming that cryptography is perfect and there are no implementation bugs, there could be protocol flaws. Most famous toy example is the Needham-Schroeder protocol. Well, it's not a toy example. It's a real protocol that's been around for 10 years before Gavin Loeb found an attack on that protocol. I'm going to use 802.11i, which is a new proposal. Well, it's not a proposal anymore, which is a new standard for authentication in wireless networks to further motivate some of the problems here. So 802.11i is a fairly big protocol that consists of 4 or 5 parts. So there's some kind of negotiations in the beginning. Then there's authentication phase, where you're usually going to use TLS. Then whatever you get from that, whatever key material that you get from authentication phase, you use in the key management phase to create temporary keys for sessions, to create group keys. And then you finally use those temporary keys and group keys to do some kind of data protection protocol. So one thing that we like to explore that we like to use while analyzing a protocol of this magnitude is divide and conquer paradigm. So all of these components, we like to analyze all of these components separately and then somehow combine them into a proof of correctness of the final protocol. The problem here is that composition doesn't work very well with security. Even if protocols run perfectly fine in isolation, the attacker can combine data from different protocols and seriously break them. So an examples of this, usually you're never going to run protocols in isolation. After you run SSL, you're going to do something with the key material that you get out of it. Furthermore, for backwards compatibility, you're going to usually run 3 or 4 copies, 3 or 4 versions of the same protocol, often operating on the same set of key material. And it's really not trivial to deduce that the final system is correct, even if all of the components are correct independently. So what we do is we develop a protocol composition logic that enables us to reason about protocols and prove their properties in a modular fashion. And there's been a lot of work in this area most recent work by Canetti and Pitzman-Widener is fairly influential, but I'm not going to talk about that here. Another thing that we'd like to do is, combine logic and cryptography. So what you start with, the assumptions that you start with are, signature schemes has this cryptographic property, encryption has this cryptographic property. What you like to get in the end is something like authentication. And there's a long way between those two notions, because when defining what a property of a good encryption scheme is, you're talking about probabilistic polynomial time Turing machines, probability of winning some game being negligible, and so on, while in the end you have something that's abstract as authentication. And our result here is we develop a computational version of the same logic where we hope to have the same formal proofs whose meaning is actually computational. I think that concludes the overview part. I hope I motivated you for the second part of the talk, which is the actual technical stuff. So I'm going to illustrate the basic idea behind protocol composition logic using a simple three-message challenge-response protocol based on signatures. So in this message, A sends a nonce to B, gets back another nonce and B's signature over both nonces and A's identity, and sends back his own signature over both nonces and B's identity. And the property we'd like this protocol to have is authentication. For example, for the initiator in this protocol, we're going to call her Alice. She'd like to reason that after she's done with the protocol, it has to be that Bob was at the other end, even though they are communicating over an untrusted network. So an example reasoning that Alice may do is, after she's done with the protocol, she knows that she received the signature in the message too, so she knows if Bob is honest and he didn't give his keys away, only Bob can generate his signature. That's protocol-independent reasoning. Then she can use some protocol-dependent reasoning. So she knows if Bob is honest, if Bob is following this protocol, he's only going to generate this signature as a part of the second message, after receiving this first message before. So combining these two, she can deduce that after she's done with the protocol, it has to be that Bob received her message and then sent back his response. So just to summarize the ideas, so we want to, in the reasoning about protocols, we're going to reason from a point of view of a participant who just executed a number of actions. And in reasoning, the participant uses local information. So Alice knows the action that she did. She incorporates knowledge of the protocol. Bob must be following this role. And she incorporates what she knows about cryptography. Signatures are impossible or hard to forge, so it must be if I see Bob's signature that he really sent it. And we avoid explicit reasoning about the intruder, which makes us different from most other formal methods for reasoning about security protocols. The formalism itself consists of two parts. Execution model and the protocol description language is based on chord calculus. And protocol logic is a Floyd-Hoare style logic for expressing and proving protocol properties. And of course, there's a Soundness theorem which says everything you prove using the proof system does in fact hold for the logic. So let's go and see how this looks like. The set of terms that you can use in the protocol is built from nonces, names, and keys by tupling, signing, and encryption. So a standard set of operations in protocols. The set of actions are, you can generate a new nonce, new random number, you can send a term, you can receive a term into a variable, and you can match a term against a pattern. So we use matching to do projection, pairing, encryption, and signature verification. And a chord or a program is just a sequence of these actions. So for example, the challenge response protocol that I just talked about can be described using chords as writing two roles. So initiator in the protocol is going to execute the program on the left, and the responder in the protocol is going to execute the program on the right. So how do we execute protocols? So chord space is just a multiset of chords. Basically, you take a number of these programs and put them in a bag together, and in this bag, they can react. Execution model is inspired by the chemical abstract machine. I think it has to do something with chemistry probably. So you put them all together in a bag, and they can react. Some kind of reactions can happen. And basically, there are two kind of reactions that happen in this bag. They can be internal actions. I can generate a new nonce, and then I generate a new nonce by choosing a new constant, and then by substitution, I propagate that constant through my program. Or they could be external actions. I can take one send and one receive, match them, and substitute the variable that is substitute the term that has been sent for the variable into which the term was received. So, to summarize, execution model is very simple, and information flow and communication is modeled by term substitution.
Has a formal relation to spy calculus of Abadi and Gordon been studied? Because this is more or less the same idea. This is spy calculus reaction, right?
It has not been studied. There are some subtle differences that have to do with variables, parallel composition, non-determinism, and so on. So we believe that this is slightly more expressive, although we haven't proved the result that says so. So we described how the execution of protocol works, and now we'd like to develop a formal language that will say something about protocol properties. So we use a model operator, and its informal meaning is if formula phi holds at some point in the run, after which a participant P does a number of actions, then formula psi holds in the resulting state, regardless of what the other principals do, and regardless of what the attacker program is, and regardless of what the attacker does.
It's just like a Hoare triple, right?
Yeah, Hoare triple. And so what kind of formulas can we have as preconditions and postconditions? Well, roughly we can group them into who did what. You can reason that a particular principal send the message or receive the message or verify the signature. You can reason about knowledge. A particular principal has a term or doesn't have a term. And you can make assumptions about honesty. You can say if Bob is honest, meaning that he's didn't give his keys away and he's either running SSL or something else, then I can deduce something about his behavior. So just to give you an example of a property, for the challenge response protocol that I just described, you would say something like, if I start from a state where M is fresh, whatever fresh means at this point, and you follow the initiator role, in the state where you're done, the following authentication property holds. If B is honest, then these actions happen, then they happen in this order. So there is also a temporal operator in the logic. And this is a fairly standard notion of authentication based on matching conversation. So basically, I'm saying when I'm done with the protocol, and I think I talked with Dejan, it has to be that he is also done to the protocol and that our records of the run match one-to-one. So it's a fairly strong notion of authentication. So we'd like to prove this. And proof system consists of a number of axioms and proof rules. And roughly, we can divide them into 3 categories. So we can reason about possession. After I receive something, I have it. Or if I have a pair, then I have its components. We can reason about crypto primitives, such as if X is honest and some Y decrypts a message encrypted for X, encryption here is public key encryption, then it has to be that X equals Y, meaning if a party is honest, he didn't give his keys away, so he's the only one who can decrypt messages that were meant for him. Similarly, there's an axiom for signature verification. There are also a number of other proof rules and axioms that let us reason about temporal order of actions, about actions of honest participants, and so on. So this has been a summary of the underlying formalism that we're going to use to try to tackle these problems. So now I'm going to talk about compositional reasoning. How do you use this logic and prove properties of protocols in a modular fashion? How do you prove two protocols independently correct, and then put the proofs together and prove their composition correct in some way? So there are two main ideas or main conceptual things when reasoning about composition. So first of all, there's the non-destructive combination. We have to, when putting two protocols together, we have to ensure that they do not degrade each other's security. If a proof of correctness of SSL relies on the fact that whenever you send a signature of a certain form, you must be in this state, and after receiving that message, then that assumption is going to fail if you run additional protocol on the same set of keys, which doesn't do that. So in logic, we do that by what's called invariance assertions, and I'm going to talk more about that. The second idea is additive combination. So we'd like to accumulate security properties of combined parts, assuming that the first bullets went through, assuming that they do not interfere. In logic, we model that by before-after assertions. So we'd like to say something like, after you're done with TLS, you have a shared key, and we have another protocol which says if you had a shared key and you did some handshake to derive a session key, then if that shared key was secret, that this session key is also secret. In logic, we do that using these before-after assertions. So intuition behind composition is that whenever you do a proof, there's a number of steps that are protocol independent, and there's a number of steps that are protocol specific. So reasoning of the form, if you have a pair, then you have both of its components, or of the form only Bob can generate his signatures, doesn't really depend on the protocols that are running out there. And this part of the proof is still good, is not affected by composition. So if Bob is running something else, this part of the proof still goes through. So what's different is protocol-specific reasoning. So if Bob generates a signature of this form, he must have received a message of that form. And this part could break. And the simple idea behind this technicality of formalizing protocol composition is when combining protocols, we have to check that the protocol-dependent steps of the proof still hold. So we do that by capturing them using invariants. So invariant is a formula that is true in all states and typically says something like, if you send a message like that, then you must have received a message like this. So we prove formulas of that form for a particular protocol using an invariance rule, which is called honesty rule. And it's basically inductive rule. It says if this is true at the beginning and every sequence of steps that you do preserves this invariance, then this is a really invariant of the protocol. It holds in every state. So the question is, so if you prove something about that for one protocol, for SSL, for example, does it still hold if you run TLS or an older version of SSL at the same time using the same set of keys? So technically, the honesty rule is given here in the middle bullet. So basically, we're saying phi is an invariant if it's true at the beginning of the protocol, if you do nothing, and if every basic sequence of the protocol preserves it. So it's a simple inductive rule. And the example is, in this challenge response protocol, you can show using this rule that whenever X sends a message that looks like a message 2, he must have previously received a message that looks like a message 1. So to illustrate this with an example, I'm just going to use a simple sequential composition of two protocols, one of which doesn't send any messages. That's why it's going to be simple. and one of which does send a few messages around. So we're going to look at the challenge response protocol, and we're going to look at the Diffie-Hellman primitive. So in this first protocol, which we call Diffie-Hellman protocol, participants don't do anything. I generate a new nonce, and I output G to the A to myself. I don't send it out. And the other guy also generates his secret exponent, and he outputs his exponential. And it's true after you do this that your Diffie-Hellman exponential is fresh. And you didn't use any invariance here in proving that. However, for challenge response, the precondition is that this M that you use to authenticate is fresh, and the postcondition is authentication. However, to prove this, you did use a few invariants. So when you put them together, you have to check for additive combination that the postcondition of Diffie-Hellman protocol matches the precondition of the challenge response protocol. And also you have to show non-destructive combination, that Diffie-Hellman and challenge response satisfy each other's invariance. So for this simple protocol, this goes through easily because the first protocol doesn't really send any messages, so it trivially satisfies the invariance of the challenge response protocol. So what you do in the end, when you do sequential composition with substitution, you get what's called the ISO 9798-3 protocol, which is a authenticated key exchange protocol based on Diffie-Hellman and signatures, which achieves authentication, which inherits it from the challenge response protocol, and it achieves secrecy, which is separately proved, and it's basically inherited from the Diffie-Hellman protocol. Formally, how authentication works, how composition works in logic, you have two protocols, and each of them have different properties, assuming a set of invariants. When you put them together, composition of two protocols is just, you can either sequentially compose them, so concatenate roles with substitution, or you can compose them in parallel. Just say you can run SSL and you can run something else with the same key material. And for the old proofs to go true, you need to check that the protocols satisfy each other's invariants. So it's a relatively little overhead. You have to do much less proof for this final step of verifying that the protocols satisfy each other's invariants. So formally, this is what composition rules look like. So there's a weakening rule if some formula is provable from a set of invariants, is also provable from a larger set of invariants. Sequential composition rule lets you put two roles together and discharge the precondition of one role if it matches the postcondition of the other role. And finally, you can show that if the protocols satisfy each other's invariants, then all of the invariants are satisfied in the final protocol. And this last step...
This is kind of general Floyd-Hoare logic. It has nothing to do with protocols, this slide, right?
Well, it does a little bit, because this is not true in general. So what I was going to say, this last step is not really a theorem about the model, because it's not true for the model. There are things that hold for protocols, but do not hold for their composition, right? Such as I send only two messages. Mm-hmm. If I take two protocols which both only send two messages, when I put them together, resulting protocol sends 4 messages. Yeah. So this is really a theorem about the proof system, mm-hmm. and it only works for the invariants which are proved using the honesty rule. So big picture is, if you by separating the protocol independent part from the protocol dependent part, we obtain a set of invariants which characterize the safe environment, which characterize an environment where protocol can run and still preserve the original properties. And we avoid, while composing, we do not reason about the attacker explicitly in any way. And so this is a different from assumed guarantee methodology in distributed computing, because our assumptions are not about the whole system. We only make assumptions about honest agents. We don't make assumptions about the attacker. And it's different from universal composability and related stuff because, well, I'm not going to get into that. And this method has been successfully applied to a number of industrial protocols. Things that's most fresh is the analysis of IEEE 802.11i authentication suite of protocols. So this is the new wireless standard that has been ratified last year. So there was an attack here. It wasn't a serious attack. It was a denial of service attack, which was found by one person at our group, and he suggested the fix. That fix was adopted by the IEEE working group. We also looked at IKE version 2. So IKE is a protocol that's used in IPSec for authentication and key exchange. We looked at TLS SSL as a part of analyzing IEEE 802.11i because TLS is a part of that protocol suite. We looked at mobile IP. This is work in progress. It's interesting. I wish I had more slides on that because while I was waiting at the reception area, I looked at this Microsoft bulletin, and it says that IPv6 has been successfully implemented and is running on all current OSs, Microsoft OSs. And there's a complete section about mobility and why is this important. So mobility, basically, it's a very simple idea. In IPv6, your address can change. You can, talk. You can have some video streamed on your cell phone while traveling in the train, and your IP address is going to change all the time, and you want this not to affect your connection. So one simple fix for that is to tunnel everything through your home agent. When I come here at Microsoft, I keep my Stanford IP, but everything is tunneled through Stanford. But for efficiency purposes, what they do is in the IPv6, they have these updates. When I change my address, I say, well, I'm not at Stanford anymore. Now my care of address is at Microsoft, and please send me stuff here. The problem is that this, of course, introduces attacks unless some kind of security mechanism is in place. Why? It's much easier to hijack connections now. I can just say, well, my name is Dan Rosenzweigen. Please forward me his mail. It also introduces denial of service threats because I can say, we can all say, oh, my address is CNN.com and start a lot of traffic that will go to CNN.com. And so you need to use some kind of security mechanism to prevent this. However, the assumption behind mobile IP is that public key infrastructure is too expensive. So basically, let's do security, let's have authentication, but we don't want public key infrastructure. I mean, in theory, you cannot do that without public key infrastructure. So the attacker can always break the protocol and hijack traffic. But what they say is, well, let's make it in such a way that it's at least as hard to do it for him now as if there was no mobile IP. And it's not clear if they had achieved that goal. So a person working in my group, he claims that he found a new attack, and we were supposed to discuss it this week. Unfortunately, I'm here now, so I don't know, is that really an attack or not? Anyway, that was a little digression. What I also wanted to emphasize is that this protocol composition logic has been used successfully by people outside of our group on Stanford by, for example, Iliano Cervesato and Kathy Meadows. Iliano analyzed Kerberos. Kathy looked at secure group communication protocol. She actually found a serious authentication flow there, and her fix was also adopted by the working group. So this is a good benchmark for any formal method, because if you're in the formal methods business, you'd like to influence the design process. You want to, as soon as the protocol is proposed, while it's in the draft stage, you like to look at it, analyze it, and because if you break it after it's deployed, then it didn't help anyone. And also, there is a implementation of this logic inside an Isabelle, which is a higher order logic theorem prover. So far, most of the proofs, all of these proofs on this slide are worked out in the formal system by hand. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to automatize that process. And a couple of students used Isabelle, which is a higher order theorem prover, to do that. And they implemented a good part of the functionality, and it works well. Another piece of software that's being developed to support this logic is the protocol derivation assistant, which is developed by Matthias Anlauf at Castrelli Institute, which is a basically graphical support tool for protocol design, which should automatically generate proofs, or at least generate stuff that you should prove before combining protocols and claiming that the composition is correct. Okay, any questions so far? No? Okay, in this last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about complexity-theoretic foundations. So maybe I haven't stressed this enough, but all of this work is in what's called the Dolev-Yao model of cryptography. So basically, all of our actions are symbolic, and the attacker is symbolic as well. What does that mean? It means that we assume cryptography is absolutely perfect. There's no way to encrypt something unless we really have the term with which that was encrypted. And that's really not the case in the real world. So cryptography is a real thing. The output is a bit string, and it doesn't come with such strong properties. It comes with a cryptographic security properties which say, this attacker can win a certain game with high probability or with negligible probability. And we'd like to kind of connect two worlds. So in the symbolic model, the attacker has a fixed set of actions, and it's non-deterministic, and it's not bounded. It can spend any time he wants computing. And security properties are ideal. Basically, not having a message, meaning you don't have that term representing a message. There's no notion of partial knowledge here. But however, these two abstractions enable us to automatize proof and develop model checking tools and so on, and successfully analyze protocols. So in the complexity-theoretic model, the attacker can do any probabilistic polynomial time computation. Security properties are fine-grained, no partial information or even a fixed security parameter. If the attacker spends time t, then his probability of guessing is at most epsilon. And analysis methods that so far are only hand proofs. And an example, hand proof of an Edom-Schroeder-Low protocol by Bogdan Varinsky is, a 15-page paper. And the protocol is simple three-message toy protocol. So it's with only encryption. And the question is that that's not really applicable to something like 802.11i, where you have 5 components, 5 messages each, you have signature, you have hash, you have encryption. So there's no proof of SSL, of correctness of SSL in this model yet. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to I guess this is a long-term project. So what we'd like to do is have the best of both worlds. We want to have a formal system and prove something in this formal system, but then we want whatever formula we prove that it means something in the complexity-theoretic model. So talk so far has been about symbolic Dolev-Yao model. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to keep the same syntax of the protocols, plus or minus delta. We'd like to keep a same or a similar proof system, so keep the same method of reasoning. However, we want the meaning of we want our formulas to be interpreted in a computational complexity-theoretic model. And so this has been a project that we started very recently, and we have some preliminary results, but there's still much more work to be done. So the main result is, basically took the fragment of the logic that I just described and attached computational complexity-theoretic semantics. And the Soundness theorem says something like, if I can formally prove this property within the proof system of the computational protocol composition logic, then it holds if the attacker is a probabilistic polynomial time machine with the probability which is close to 1 in the security parameter. So before going into a little more details, there's been a lot of research in this area, most notably Buddy Rogway, who only looked at the case of passive attackers, Michanchi-Wawrinski more recently. And what distinguishes us from all of that work is that they aren't looking at the relationship between the model. They take the symbolic model on one side and the computational model on the other side, and then they show that every attack in the computational model can be transformed to an attack in the symbolic model. Therefore, absence of attacks in the symbolic model implies absence of attacks in the computational model. And we're trying to not to look at two models, but just look at one model and develop formal methods for reasoning within that computational model. So Dan was persuading me yesterday that relating model is a much easier thing to do, especially using tools such as interactive abstract state machines and their refinement, but it still hasn't persuaded me completely yet. Okay. So just to give you another example, so far our syntax, what we've done so far is we have a protocol, we have a logic for protocols which only use nonces and which only use asymmetric encryption. And as far as properties of the logic and proof system are concerned, we have a very small fragment, and we're only able to look at STOI protocols for now. So an example, if I send a nonce encrypted to Bob with his key, and then I get that nonce back, we can show that a form of authentication property holds for this protocol. From Alice's point of view, when she's done with the protocol, she knows that Bob was alive and Bob was talking to her. Secrecy is more interesting because it's very different from the secrecy in the symbolic world. So basically, when I send a message, when Alice sends a message to Bob, and she uses Bob's key to decrypt it, she uses Bob's key to encrypt it, she should be guaranteed that no attacker has any partial information about that message. However, in the symbolic model, you cannot capture that. You can either have the whole term or nothing. And so this notion of knowledge, which was just one predicate has, kind of breaks up into pieces now. And a predicate for modeling absence of partial information is called indistinguishable. So we would say for this protocol, we can prove something like if Bob is honest, meaning that he didn't disclose his key, then, and he's following the protocol, then any participant which is different from Alice and Bob, for him, this nonce, which is inside the message, is completely indistinguishable for random. He has absolutely no partial information about it. So formally, it looks like something like it looks something like this. So formalized true in a protocol is if for all attackers, for all distinguishers, there is a negligible function, and so on and so forth. This is not really important. Important is that the main technical idea is that we take a look at set of all possible traces with the randomness fixed, and then we measure the ratio of the set of traces where the formula holds versus the whole set of traces, and that should be overwhelming. And semantics, so basically semantics of formula is just a transformation on the set of traces. Given a formula and a set of traces, semantics of that formula is some subset, and intuitive meaning is a subset with that, where that formula holds. In this world, it's easy to define semantics of connectives such as and, or. So and is just the intersection, or is just the union, not is a complement. This didn't turn out well. Implication turns out to be more tricky because it seems that inherently has to be related to conditional probability. So what you're probably wondering is where is all the hard work? So if you do a formal proof and it has a meaning in computational model, how did we avoid reasoning about the attacker and probabilities explicitly? Well, it's not under the carpet, but it's in the appendix in the proofs of soundness of the proof system. And just to give you a flavor, what kind of reasoning we use and what kind of proof rules and axioms we have. So roughly, we can divide them into 3 classes. So there's information-theoretic reasoning. The first axiom says if I generate a new nonce and do nothing else, then for anyone else but myself, this nonce is indistinguishable from random. So this is trivially sound by an information-theoretic argument. Then there's complexity-theoretic assumptions. So this axiom is stating some property of encryption. It says if I send an encrypted message to Bob and Bob doesn't decrypt it, then this should be indistinguishable from random to anyone else other than me and Bob. And we prove the soundness of this axiom by reducing it to a property of the encryption scheme used. So what we say is if the encryption scheme is in CCA2 secure, then this axiom holds. And the proof goes by showing that if there is an attacker who can make this formula false, we can use it and transform an attacker that breaks the encryption scheme. And finally, there's asymptotic calculations. For example, modus ponens, when you're proving it correct, you just need to show that the sum of 2 negligible functions is also negligible. So current work, there's a lot of current work in this area. So we're looking at what is this thing that we build, because the propositional fragment is not classical. Implication represents conditional probability. So this is inherently has to be like that because of the nature of cryptographic reductions. And there may be some connections with probabilistic logics. What we'd like to do is we like to, of course, generalize all of this. Like I said, this delta is pretty big right now, the difference between the computational and the symbolic world. So we'd like to add more useful stuff, more primitives and more axioms and proof rules, which are useful for reasoning about these primitives. And something that we're looking at as an intermediate step, we'd like to develop information-theoretic semantics for this logic. I think that concludes my talk, and I'm happy to take questions.
Question, comments?
Okay. If there are no questions, thank you very much for showing up.